Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jeremy Collins with the National WWII Museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. It's my pleasure to be with you all today and to have 5 wonderful panelists with us. To chair today's session, it's my pleasure to hand it over to a colleague and a friend of mine, Dr. Adam Givens. He is the National WWII Museum DPAA Research Partner Fellow. He earned his PhD in history from Ohio University. And prior to joining the museum last year, Adam was an adjunct researcher for the RAND Corporation and conducted research for the Monuments Men Foundation. If you have questions during this program, we encourage you to please type them in the Q&A box. Those of you on Facebook, please write them in the comment section and we'll get to as many as we can. But now it's my pleasure to pass it on over to Adam. Adam?
Thanks, Jeremy. And thanks also to our audience who are viewing this special roundtable discussion today. We have an excellent panel of 4 historians. They represent an array of government offices and agencies, and they'll each have between 10 to 15 minutes to introduce different aspects of how the United States dealt with the remains of those killed in World War II. They'll share research related to unidentified American service members from the war and their burial places around the globe, and they'll also tell us about ongoing efforts to account for the missing. After the presentations, we'll spend about 20 minutes holding a roundtable discussion. We'll draw out some larger themes and think about the significance of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in this centennial year. After that, we'll have some time near the end for audience questions, as Jeremy said. And following the Q&A, Allison and Jeremy will close out the program with concluding remarks. But to start, I'm going to introduce each of the panelists right now in the order that they will be presenting. I will also be presenting briefly at the end, but before me will be our 4 guests. First is Allison Finkelstein, who earned her PhD in U.S. history from the University of Maryland, College Park. She currently serves as senior historian at Arlington National Cemetery. Dr. Finkelstein previously worked for the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services History Office and Library, the American Battle Monuments Commission, and the Vietnam War Commemoration Program. Her first book, Forgotten Veterans and Visible Memorials, How American Women Commemorated the Great War in 1917 and 1945, was published by the University of Alabama Press earlier this month. From 2017 to 2018, the Arlington County Board appointed her as the chair of the Arlington World War I Commemoration Task Force. Our second panelist is Richard Holver, who earned his doctorate from West Virginia University. He currently works in the National Cemetery Administration's History Office. Prior to joining NCAA, he worked for the Naval History and Heritage Command. He's also worked with the United States Southern Command, the American Battle Monuments Commission, and the Army Chief of Staff's 2003 to 2011 Iraq War Study Group. At Naval History and Heritage Command, Richard's research on the loss of the World War II cruiser USS Indianapolis helped teams discover the wreckage of the ship in August 2017. He authored and edited a history covering the loss of the ship titled A Grave Misfortune, the USS Indianapolis Tragedy. In 2020, he served as lead author on an NCA publication, America's World War II Burial Program. Going third is Ben Brands, a historian for the American Battle Monuments Commission. Ben is a PhD candidate at George Mason University. He was previously an infantry officer in the United States Army. He's taught military history at the United States Military Academy at West Point and Oregon State University. Our 4th presenter is Michael Dolskey, who has worked for the Defense POW accounting agency or its predecessor for the past decade. Over those years, he served as an historian, a planner, and team leader. He now functions as the operations team leader for the partnership program. Michael earned his PhD from Temple University in 2012. His own research and writing is often focused on historical remembrance and commemoration of military affairs. Allison, thanks very much to you and the Arlington National Cemetery for partnering with the National WWII Museum to present this program. I'm going to turn it over to you now to introduce this great series this webinar is part of, and also to tell us about the history of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
Thank you, Adam. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here virtually tonight. It is really an honor to be working with the National World War II Museum and presenting alongside this wonderful group of historians and friends. Thank you to Jeremy and the museum for hosting us, and to our panelists for their contributions. Before we start, I do have one quick housekeeping item on behalf of myself and fellow government employees Ben and Richard. The remarks you hear from us tonight do not represent official policy. With that said, let's begin. I am going to use my portion of the program to introduce and contextualize our larger discussion about World War II unknowns within the history of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Doing so will enable the other speakers to dive into more specific topics related to the missions of their organizations. First, I will provide a quick introduction to Arlington National Cemetery. Second, I will outline our current effort to commemorate the centennial of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Third, I will share a very short summary of the tomb's history. I will conclude with a reflection on the meaning of the tomb and how it connects to the work of the institutions represented on this roundtable. Slide, please. Founded in 1864, Arlington National Cemetery is the nation's premier military cemetery. Today, we remain both an active cemetery and a historic site rooted in critical chapters of our nation's past. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the cemetery, so for time's sake, I'm only going to provide an abbreviated history. If you are interested in learning more, I encourage you to visit our website where we have many historical and educational resources. Slide, please. The story of Arlington National Cemetery began during the American Civil War. The land that now comprises the cemetery had been owned by Mary Custis Lee, the wife of Robert E. Lee. Her father, who was the step-grandson of George Washington, had established a plantation there, run on the labor of enslaved African Americans. When Lee decided to side with the rebelling states, the family left the estate, and the U.S. Army built fortifications on the high ground there to protect Washington, D.C. They also established a Freedmen's Village, a refugee camp for formerly enslaved people in the region. By 1864, the mounting death toll of the Civil War compelled the Army to start burying the war dead on the Arlington estate, leading to the creation of Arlington National Cemetery. However, it was not immediately considered an honor to be buried at Arlington or any of the other national cemeteries, many of which are run by the National Cemetery Administration today. Next slide, please. This did not start to change until after the war, as Arlington gradually became a focus of commemorative rituals. Starting in 1868, it hosted the annual National Decoration Day observance. This is now called Memorial Day. The Army built an amphitheater for this ceremony, but as the event grew in popularity, this amphitheater became too small, and a new one, named Memorial Amphitheater, was dedicated in 1920. This larger amphitheater would soon take on a new meaning with the addition of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier to its exterior plaza just 1 year later. It is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier which has brought us all together tonight on the occasion of its centennial year. Now that you all know a little bit about the cemetery's origins, I would like to share with you more about the Centennial. Arlington National Cemetery has been designated as the official government leader of the tomb's centennial. To fulfill this mission, we have developed an exciting program of events, ceremonies, and projects throughout this year. Slide, please. First, we created 2 new museum exhibits that explore the history and legacy of the tomb. One is located in the Memorial Amphitheater display room, just steps from the tomb itself, and the other is at our Welcome Center. They are both currently open to the public, and you can see pictures of the display room exhibit on the screen. With the U.S. Army Center of Military History, we are publishing 2 commemorative products. One is a short illustrated commemorative guide to the tomb. The other is a comprehensive history of the tomb's creation. Based on extensive primary source research, this book will provide an in-depth analysis of the origins of the tomb. Both publications will be available both as your traditional hard copy, but also as free digitized web publications. To reach students of all ages, including lifelong learners like yourselves, we also released an education module about the tomb as part of our larger education program. This module is available for free on our website. It includes walking tours, primary sources, and all sorts of resources that you can use to learn about the cemetery from home or actually at a cemetery visit. A key part of the Centennial program, of course, is our monthly virtual events series, which includes our program tonight. So far, the series has included several webinars with the National WWII Museum and Memorial, and videos that highlight different aspects of the tomb, from horticulture to historic preservation. The tomb's centennial will culminate during the week of Veterans Day. In the days ahead of November 11th, if the pandemic allows, we will be organizing a flower ceremony during which members of the public will be permitted to place a flower at the tomb. This is a very rare opportunity for the public to come face to face with the tomb and actually honor the unknowns where they lie buried. On Veterans Day, there will be a ceremonial procession through the cemetery to the tomb. It will evoke elements of the one that transported the World War I unknown from the Capitol to Memorial Amphitheater in 1921. The annual National Veterans Day observance will then take place and include special features to mark the centennial. Starting in 1921, the government intended the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier to serve as a people's memorial, a place for the public to come together to honor the military dead on both an individual and a collective level. A century later, this same spirit infuses our commemoration of the centennial. We are using this anniversary to share the history and meaning of the tomb, while uniting the nation in a reflection on the meaning of sacrifice. We are encouraging everyone to participate in the centennial from wherever they live, and at the end of the program, I'm going to provide some information about how you can do this. Let's turn now to a brief history of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, so you can understand its origins and how it eventually came to include one unknown American service member from World War II. Slide. The Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is a product of the First World War. The destructive nature of World War I combat and improved weapons technology resulted in a heartbreaking number of unknown and unidentifiable war dead. In 1920, Great Britain and France each buried an unknown soldier in a special tomb to represent these losses. Inspired by them, the United States decided to do the same and eventually chose to locate the tomb at Arlington's new Memorial Amphitheater. Slide. On October 24th, 1921, in the town of Chalon-sur-Marne, France, decorated World War I veteran Sergeant Edward Younger selected one American unknown from among 4 caskets to be buried in this planned tomb. Amidst a series of ceremonies from the French, this newly selected unknown began his final journey home aboard the USS Olympia. After his arrival at the Washington Navy Yard, the unknown was taken to the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, where he lay in state for 2 days. Over 90,000 people came to pay their respects there. The entirety of the ceremonies surrounding the unknown's burial were intended to unite the American people in a national moment of mourning. An elaborate funeral procession accompanied the casket to the ceremony for the burial on November 11th, the anniversary of Armistice Day. Slide. In his speech during the unknown's funeral, President Harding explained that the unknown, quote, might have come from any one of millions of American homes, end quote. The Allied nations presented the unknown with medals, and he was laid to rest in a hastily constructed tomb overlooking the nation's capital. After the funeral, a contentious debate about the tomb's final design began. It took another 11 years just to finish the design and construction of the tomb as it looks today. In the meantime, it had already started to evolve into a sacred shrine where visitors, both foreign and domestic, came to honor the unknown soldier. Slide. By the onset of the Second World War, the tomb had become even more deeply entrenched in American commemorative culture. Americans now faced the grim reality of mourning another generation of missing and unidentifiable service members, this time sprawled even more broadly across the globe. The tomb formed the most fitting place to mourn and memorialize them. In 1948, Congress passed legislation which authorized the burial of one unidentified service member from World War II at the tomb. Plans took shape slowly as methods for including bodies from each of the many different geographic theaters of the war were considered. But the outbreak in 1950 of the Korean War halted the planning process. After the Korean War, interest in the effort revived, and a new law in 1956 authorized the burial of an unknown service member from the Korean War at the tomb. Instead of creating new tomb structures at the site, though, these unknowns would be buried in two crypts located on the tomb plaza. In May 1958, the World War II unknown was chosen through a complex selection process, which Ben will describe in more detail. One unknown service member from the Korean War was also selected at that time, and these two newly designated unknown soldiers began the voyage home. Slide. Once in Washington, many ceremonial elements of the 1921 burial were repeated. Then, on Memorial Day, a dual funeral interred them at the tomb. Now, this differentiated the American tomb from others, as most countries did not add unknowns from additional conflicts to the tombs. Although it began as a First World War grave, the tomb now became a monument to multiple wars. While it still held personal meaning for the families of the unaccounted for, it also served as a symbol of nationalism and American military power. The question of expanding the tomb came up again after the Vietnam War. However, improved recovery methods and technological and scientific advances opened the possibility that all unknowns from Vietnam could one day be identified. Slide. Yet, public pressure to inter a Vietnam War unknown continued. On Memorial Day in 1984, President Ronald Reagan presided over the funeral of a Vietnam unknown at the tomb. But by 1998, advancements in DNA research enabled this unknown to be identified as Air Force First Lieutenant Michael Blassie. Blassie's family chose to rebury him at Jefferson Barracks National Cemetery in Missouri, run by the National Cemetery Administration. His empty crypt now stands as a monument to all missing and unknown Americans who served in the Vietnam War. It also signals that there may never be another unidentified service member buried at the tomb. To conclude, I would like to reflect on the tomb's meaning and think about how it connects all of the organizations you will hear from on our roundtable. When people visit the tomb of the unknown soldier, they sometimes focus so much on the precise rituals of the tomb guards and the tomb's renown as a tourist attraction that they may forget the real meaning of this place. They can get lost in the grandeur of the marble monument and the spectacular view of Washington, D.C. Slide, please. But to focus only on those things would miss both the practical function of the tomb and its deeper significance. In the simplest terms, the tomb is the grave of 3 unidentified American service members, nameless and unknown still. For decades, the family, friends, and comrades of those service members with no known grave visited the tomb to honor these men. For them, it was the only grave they had. Even today, some still visit the tomb for this deeply personal purpose. But the tomb's meaning goes beyond just those 3 individuals. As direct mourners from the 20th century's wars have decreased, the tomb has evolved into a central site of American memory, a place of collective mourning for all those who have died for our nation since its founding. When we honor the tomb, we are honoring all American unknowns around the world, no matter where they lie and when they perished. The tomb represents them all. And it's this universality of the tomb that is the inspiration for our program tonight. Each of these institutions represented here plays a part in maintaining the tomb's legacy. By specifically examining World War II unknowns, our roundtable is using World War II as a case study to demonstrate the tomb's continued relevance. Slide, please. The VA's National Cemetery Administration runs the military cemeteries in the United States that contain the graves of numerous World War II unknowns. The tomb honors those service members. The American Battle Monuments Commission is the steward of the overseas cemeteries that include unidentified service members from World War II and walls of the missing that list the names of those unaccounted for. The tomb honors those service members. The Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency works to find and identify the remains of missing and unaccounted for Americans, including many from World War II. The tomb honors those service members. And the National World War II Museum tells the story of the American experience in World War II and all who supported the war effort. The tomb honors those service members. By taking part in our program tonight, you too are honoring the tomb and all it stands for. Thank you for taking the time to do so during this, the Centennial commemoration of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Allison. Speaking next, we have Richard Holver from the National Cemetery Administration's History Office.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, everyone. I'm honored to be a part of this panel and represent the National Cemetery Administration, and I want to give a special thanks to Arlington National Cemetery for putting this together and inviting their colleagues and similar federal agencies to collaborate in their remembrance of the Tomb of the Unknown. And while this is a roundtable about World War II unknowns, I feel that it's somewhat necessary for me to provide a little background on the National Cemetery Administration. So NCA is one of 3 administrations within the Department of Veterans Affairs. The other administrations are Veterans Health and Veterans Benefits. Each of the administrations has their own history office. And in the past few years, we've also stood up a central VA history office on the secretary level that kind of oversees the historic programs throughout the administrations. And I think it's safe to say, slide, Jeremy, please. So I think it's safe to say that in terms of property and number of veterans memorialized, NCA is by far the largest agency represented here this evening, but we're also probably the least known. I've been with NCA over a year now, and typically when I tell people what I do and that we manage national cemeteries, the first thing that someone says is, "Oh, I love Arlington," and then I have to say, "Well, actually, Arlington is one of the Army cemeteries that they maintain." And then it immediately goes to, "Oh, I love Normandy. The overseas cemeteries are great." And I have to say, well, those actually aren't NCA properties either. The ABMC oversees those and maintains those. And then usually it goes to, "Well, Gettysburg is a really cool cemetery." And I'm like, yes, it is, but those are National Park Service sites. Most of the Civil War battlefield cemeteries went to them a long time ago. And then by that point, the person's looking at me like, "Well, do you really have a job, or are you just making something up?" And then I explain that basically everything else, other than the 3 cemeteries you mentioned, NCA runs. So VA operates over 155 national cemeteries and 34 soldiers' lots and monuments across the country. Well over 4 million Americans from every war and conflict are buried in our cemeteries. And for veterans not buried in a VA national cemetery, NCA provides headstones, markers, and medallions to commemorate their service, along with the Presidential Memorial Certificate. And we're the only federal agency still, actively constructing cemeteries based on the needs of veterans and their families. The map I'm showing you here, it's kind of hard to see, but I want you to just get a sense of where our national cemeteries are and the era they were built. And that will give you an idea of how the national cemetery system has evolved, and also an understanding of the cemetery system that the World War I dead were entering into when they returned home. So everything you see on the map that's teal or kind of blue, those are the early properties that were established. Many of them were established during the Civil War, but they were established roughly Civil War through 1872. Those sites include the Army cemeteries and the MPS cemeteries. The purple sites, I would say, are kind of 1872 through the eve of World War I, so around 1916. And then the yellow sites you see, those are our interwar cemeteries and our World War II specific. And those were constructed because of rapidly depleting burial space in the teal and the blue site. And that was caused by an influx of eligible veterans with burial benefits because of the Spanish-American War, World War I, and World War II. And the yellow are really important because they represent kind of the first strategic moment in the national cemetery system thought process since the Civil War. And then the green you see, those are the more recent properties, say 1950 to present. And some things to consider as you're looking at this map, thinking about it, we're talking about World War II burials tonight, and I will say that there are really World War II burials in all of these sites, regardless of the era. They're not all in the yellow, there are higher concentrations in the yellow, but you'll find World War II burials in all of these sites. And as you look at this map, it's pretty much all an Army story until around the 1930s. Veterans Administration was established in the 30s, and they contributed to studies with the Army about where cemeteries should be built to meet veterans' needs. Also in the 1930s, that's when the Civil War battlefield sites were transferred from the Army to MPS. And then 1973, the National Cemeteries Act is passed, and Army transfers pretty much basically all of its cemeteries, but Arlington and Soldiers Home and active post cemeteries to VA. And in 1998, NCA is established. Slide, please. So with some background in place, let's shift gears and talk about America's World War II burial program. And I'm really just going to scratch the surface here tonight and give you the 30,000 foot view. If you're really interested in this, I encourage you to check out the publication you see on the slide here. This is one that the NCA History Office released just last year to commemorate the 75th anniversary of World War II. I've provided the link there at the bottom where it can be downloaded, free download. And the booklet explains an overview of how the United States World War II dead reached the final burial place. And it does so by providing background on how military dead were buried from previous wars and then focusing on World War II. And essentially, America's World War II burial program followed World War I policies. Families of those killed had a choice of where they wanted their loved ones' remains to be buried. So the federal government provided basically two choices. One, they could leave the body overseas in a permanent cemetery maintained by ABMC, or two, they could have the body shipped home at the government's expense for burial in a private cemetery or a national cemetery. The other option was to have them shipped to a foreign private cemetery if the individual would happen to be from a foreign country. And initially, the Army thought that all World War II bodies were going to be repatriated because they thought that well over 70% of the American public would want this to happen. And if that 70% threshold was met, all bodies were going to come home. But why did the Army think this? Primarily two reasons. One, the ABMC's World War I cemeteries pretty much all fell into enemy hands. So there was the thought that families would think foreign cemeteries were inherently vulnerable. And two, the remote Pacific Islands weren't really viewed as desirable locations to put beautiful permanent cemeteries. But the Army's thoughts didn't really pan out. So some numbers I've provided here just give you a sense of the contours of what we're talking about here. These are all estimates, again, just to give you an idea. So roughly 405,000 war dead, 290,000 are recovered remains that are going to be buried. 93,000 of those are going to be interred overseas. And then 171,000 or 61% will be repatriated. Families wanted them sent home. So you can see that's well below that 70% threshold. And of the 171,000 that came home, about 20% went into national cemeteries. And as you can imagine, this burial and repatriation program, it's a massive undertaking. It costs billions of dollars in today's currency. The Army's Grave Registration Service had responsibility for it, and they essentially split the world up into zones. They chose sites where permanent cemeteries were chosen, temporary cemeteries were exhumed, and the bodies were concentrated in kind of intermediate cemeteries or mausoleums in the Pacific, while families were contacted for the decision. And once a decision was made, the bodies were moved accordingly. And those that came home did so in what was called a Return of the Dead program, which ran between 1947 and 1951. And remains were shipped home on converted Liberty ships run by the U.S. Army Transportation Service. They either arrived to New York or San Francisco. From there, they were loaded onto specially made mortuary trains and went to distribution centers across the country, where they were met by an escort of that service where the deceased served, and then they went to their final resting place. Slide. And I noted that, so families are a key part. The decision of families are a key part in World War II repatriation, but some families didn't have a choice. The obvious are unknowns. So obviously families of unknowns aren't going to be contacted. The other group are group burials. And initially the War Department policy was to bring all unknown dead home for burial. That was the 1945 policy. They were all supposed to come home for burial in a national cemetery. And having unknowns in a national cemetery would not have been something new. About 140,000 of our Civil War burials are unknowns. There are numerous unknowns from pre-Civil War conflicts, Spanish-American War unknowns, Western Garrison unknowns. So wouldn't be a unique phenomenon. And I've on the slide here, you can see some different ways that unknowns have been commemorated in national cemeteries over time. But by 1947, the policy for total repatriation of unknowns changed. Congress authorized unknowns to be buried in overseas cemeteries. And this becomes somewhat confusing because of Hawaii. So the largest number of unknowns end up in the ABMC's Manila Cemetery, and then the Army's National Memorial Cemetery at the Pacific or Punch Bowl, which is in Hawaii. And it's in Hawaii before Hawaii is a state and before Hawaii is an NCA site. So while technically overseas at the time, obviously it's not now. So that kind of inserts some confusion in the numbers. And also keep in mind, some unknowns did die in the continental US and were buried. Slide. Other unknowns arrived to the United States because of the War Department's policy for group burials. So situations where vehicle crews were lost, tanks, planes, ships, bodies are recovered, but individual identification impossible. The government decides that all of these cases, these bodies are going to be sent home for burial in the National Cemetery. Now, if the names of the individuals were known, or if they could be determined by process of elimination, all of those names would appear on a group marker. It was supposed to be upright initially, but some of these became so large that uprights became aesthetically not a good thing for the cemetery, so they became flats. And the policy adopted was for, in these cases, to choose a national cemetery that was most geographically centered to the group. So the government would bring these individuals home to that central cemetery, and the families would be notified of the location. I'll say that there are some pretty odd cases with the group burials. Some of the geographic locations just make absolutely no sense when you look at where they're from. There are some that end up in ABMC sites. There's not a clear answer for this really in the records. My educated guess would be that next of kin were able to collectively agree upon an overseas burial in these cases. In some group burials, particularly I found with Navy ones, you'll see unknowns in them. And I've got a few examples here on this slide. The overwhelming majority of the group burials, they're in that Midwestern line of national cemeteries, but they're actually all over the place. Just the most of them are concentrated in the Midwestern line. The most are at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, the largest of those being a grave of 123. But like I said, they're all over. I was just in Winchester National Cemetery last week, and there's a handful of World War II group burials there. So my takeaway for this evening, before I pass it on to Ben with the ABMC, you know, we're all very familiar with the Tomb of the Unknown and the World War I and World War II unknown there, Arlington. And we're all probably familiar with Civil War unknowns if we visit a national cemetery. But just, you know, I want you to just be aware that there are World War II unknowns throughout the national cemetery system. And as we remember and reflect on the Tomb of the Unknown, also, you know, realize that as if you're out visiting these sites across the country, you know, you can pay your respect to unknowns, even some from World War II. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Richard. Next, we're going to be hearing from Ben Brands from the American Battle Monuments Commission.
Okay, good evening. I am Ben Brands, and I'm a historian with American Battle Monuments Commission. So American Battle Monuments Commission, or ABMC, is a small federal agency, and we're responsible for the administration of America's overseas military cemeteries and monuments. Currently, we're responsible for 26 cemeteries and 32 monuments across 17 foreign countries, as well as a few monuments in the United States. Slide, please. So much like the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, ABMC's origins come out of the massive death of World War I. So when World War I ends, America has to decide what to do with the more than 100,000 dead from the war. Unlike the other countries involved, America decides to give next of kin the choice whether they want their loved ones repatriated back to the United States for burial in the United States or permanently interred overseas in American military cemeteries. This is similar to the program and the kind of model for the program that Richard discussed. Ultimately, just as in World War II, as already discussed, 40% of next of kin choose to have their loved ones interred overseas, resulting in 8 permanent World War I cemeteries. In 1923, Congress creates American Battle Monuments Commission with the mission of developing a monuments program across Europe to honor the achievements of the American Expeditionary Forces. General Pershing, the commander of the AEF in World War I, is appointed the first chairman. Today, and soon after that, we're also given the mission of administering those 8 permanent cemeteries. Today, ABMC commemorates over 207,000 war dead, which includes 93,000 burials and 79,000 missing from World War II in 14 cemeteries. Along with Arlington National Cemetery and NCAA, we form kind of the third leg of America's military cemetery system. And our mission today remains, as it has always been, to help remember and honor the service and sacrifice of American war dead, especially those from World War I and World War II, buried and memorialized at our sites. Slide, please. So while ABMC was born out of World War I, soon after World War II, its mission was expanded to include the overseas cemeteries for that war as well. As in World War I, about 40% of next of kin choose that their loved ones interred overseas, resulting in 14 cemeteries. Now for World War II, there are no monuments separate from the cemeteries. The kind of global expanse and massive scale of World War II makes any sort of comprehensive monument program unrealistic. And so it's decided to not do separate monuments, and the cemeteries are then cemeteries and monuments. And so our World War II cemeteries have much more elaborate artwork, architecture, and sculpture work compared to their World War I counterparts. Now, as Allison discussed already, World War II also expanded the mission of the tomb. And so this would provide an even more direct connection between the tomb and ABMC, as the unknown for World War II was to be selected from amongst those buried in ABMC cemeteries. Slide, please. So the unknown for World War II was chosen through a series of elaborate selection ceremonies, modeled after those of World War I, but expanded for the global size and reach of World War II. And these were largely designed to ensure that the unknown in Arlington could represent all those who fought and died in World War II. For the European theater, 13 sets of remains were disinterred between December 19, 1957 and April 9, 1958, representing every ABMC cemetery in Europe and Africa other than Cambridge and Epinal. The remains were examined for any identifying information, and all record of their origins was destroyed. There was one set of these remains that was rejected due to possible identifying information, and an alternate was disinterred and substituted. These remains are then transported to Frankfurt, Germany, where a rearrangement ceremony was held during which 3 separate teams of soldiers rearranged the caskets to ensure there was no way to identify which remains came from which cemetery. The remains were then brought to Epinal American Cemetery, where they were laid and stayed at the cemetery chapel until, on May 12, 1958, a solemn selection ceremony was held during which Major General Edward J. O'Neill selected one casket to represent the European theater. The unselected remains were returned to ABMC cemeteries, where they were reburied after simple ceremonies featuring Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish chaplains. Slide, please. A similar process was followed in the Pacific. 4 sets of unknown remains from ABMC's Manila American Cemetery were disinterred on April 22, 1958, after they were randomly selected from 32 unknown graves. Again, the remains were examined for any identifying information, and the records of their origins destroyed. The remains were then transported to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, where they joined 2 unknowns from the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, located in the Punch Bowl in Hawaii, which is one of the National Cemetery Administration sites. A 24-hour honor guard watched the caskets until the selection ceremony on May 16, 1958. The selection was made by Colonel Glenn T. Eagleston, the top World War II ace of the 9th Air Force. The 5 unselected remains were reinterred at the Punch Bowl, along with the unselected remains from the Korean War unknown selection ceremony held the preceding day. Slide, please. On May 26, 1958, off the Virginia Capes, the Pacific and European World War II unknown candidates, as well as the Korean War unknown, were united aboard the USS Canberra. The World War II unknowns were moved to a separate room on board and once again rearranged by a team of sailors to eliminate any connection to their theater of origin before they were moved back above deck. Navy Hospital Corpsman First Class William R. Charette, who had earned the Medal of Honor in Korea, made the final selection. The selected remains, along with the Korean War unknown, were transferred to the USS Blandy for movement to Washington, D.C., while the USS Canberra moved to deeper waters and conducted a burial at sea for the unselected World War II unknown, once again following an ecumenical service. The World War II and Korean War unknowns lay in state at the U.S. Capitol Rotunda, just as their World War I predecessor had, until their funeral and interment at Arlington on Memorial Day, 1958. These elaborate selection rituals served 2 main functions. First, they demonstrated the respect and honor that America paid to its war dead. And second, they ensured that the remains that were finally entombed at Arlington could never be identified and could have come from any theater where Americans fought. These factors together allowed the tomb and the remains interred there to serve an important symbolic function. By removing the possibility of identification, these remains are able to stand in for every soldier, sailor, Marine, or Coast Guardsman who was never identified. While the next of kin of a missing soldier could stand in front of the tomb and imagine there's their son, husband, or brother buried there, the anonymity of the tomb extends even further, representing the honor and sacrifice of all those who paid the last full measure of devotion. Slide, please. This universality at Arlington has its counterpart in the American Battle Monuments Commission's Walls of the Missing. If the tomb of the unknown soldier symbolically represents all missing, ABMC's cemeteries and memorials literally represent them. Each American service member missing, lost, or buried at sea from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam is represented by name on the walls of the missing at one of our sites. In total, the various walls of the missing honor the memory of 4,456 missing from World War I and 78,917 from World War II. The 8,201 missing of the Korean War and the 2,504 of the Vietnam War are honored alongside their comrades from World War II at the Commission's Honolulu Memorial, which is co-located at the Punch Bowl with the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. In addition to the names inscribed on the walls of the missing, over 1,600 unknowns of World War I and almost 6,000 World War II unknowns are today buried in ABMC cemeteries. Their graves are marked, like the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, with the inscription of, "Here lies in honored glory, an American soldier, known but to God." For World War II, the phrase, "a comrade in arms," replaced American soldier to better include the fallen of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. Slide, please. If the tomb universally represents all American dead, I believe a similar process occurs at ABMC cemeteries. While each name on the walls of the missing and each individual grave represents a specific fallen American with their own story, and telling those stories is an important part of ABMC's mission. When you step back, the iconic view of our cemeteries, white crosses and stars of David, row on row, conveys its own symbolism of the sacrifice made by Americans in the two world wars, and comes to represent all those who fell. Those who are buried in our cemeteries, those resting in unknown and undiscovered graves, and those repatriated back to their families in the United States. Slide, please. The unknowns of World War II are thus honored both symbolically and specifically at the tomb at Arlington and at ABMC sites. But America's final commitment to them, which is in a bit of a contrast to the focus on anonymity of the ceremonies that selected the unknown for the tomb, is to identify them and bring them home. When a service member is identified by the Department of Defense, a rosette is added to the individual's name on our walls of the missing, denoting that their remains have been recovered and identified. Such identified remains are the only authorized new burials in ABMC's World War I and World War II cemeteries. But I'll close here and I'll let my colleagues from DPAA tell the full story of America's efforts to identify the unknown dead. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Next, we're going to hear from Michael Dolskey from the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency, or DPAA.
Great, thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'd also like to say thank you to the World War II Museum for hosting this webinar, and of course to my esteemed panelists, especially Allison, for putting together this conversation today. As Adam has indicated, I work for the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. Much like Richard, I find that when I say that to people, they often kind of blanch and express some confusion over what it is that we do for the government. So I will just start off by saying that we are a Department of Defense organization tasked to provide the fullest possible accounting for the missing personnel to the families in the nation. And what I'd like to start off by today with talking about is that the casualty accounting mission really has a very long and rich history, especially pronounced in the 20th century, as my panelists have covered to some degree already. And I really want to stress the absolutely tremendous effort of the United States government and the American society writ large to retrieve the dead and honor the loss of the missing. And in some respects, this is a story told best in reverse. Our mission is born out of the Vietnam conflict and the uncertainties that lingered at the tail end of the conclusion of that war that prompted so many families and activists and concerned citizens to challenge the government to provide resolution for their cases. And from the 1970s really forward from that key moment, there's been a concerted effort to, as I said, recover the remains of the missing or provide some accounting for those lost in the nation's past conflicts. And then there was a retrograde moment where in the 1990s and then in the early 2000s, the mission set expanded to include accounting for casualties lost from even earlier conflicts, first Korea and then the Second World War. And what I'll say about that attempt to account for missing personnel is that as a historian, I find it best to characterize it as dealing with overlapping stories or overlapping histories. One, you are dealing with the combat circumstances or the loss incident that took somebody away. But you also have to deal with the history of casualty, evacuation and treatment and handling. You also have to look at the history clustered on how remains are handled. And then, of course, as we've heard a little bit already today, a history about how remains can be transferred and used to help construct cemeteries and other places of memorial for their commemoration. So as an agency that is tasked with helping to account for individuals lost from our missing conflicts, we have to deal with those different histories to try to find a meaningful way to either retrieve, identify, and return home the remains of the missing, or to tell the story of the circumstances of the loss of those missing. And ultimately, this is a humanitarian effort to provide solace and comfort to the families, to the communities from which these individuals came, and then to the nation writ large. We work very closely while carrying on this tradition. We work very closely with other organizations, all three represented today: the National Cemetery Administration, ABMC, the Arlington National Cemetery as well. And in doing so, what we attempt to do is conduct meaningful, incisive, in-depth, and supportable research that can help us ascertain the best possible avenues to find resolution. That question of what happened, where is my missing loved one? To do that, we have a pretty diverse staff and network of people that we work with. We have researchers, of course, researchers and historians that attempt to recreate, as I said before, some of these stories, the flow of battle or the circumstances surrounding the loss. And those researchers will hopefully create a set of information that will allow individuals to investigate, to attempt to find perhaps a specific location on the ground for further activity. And that would lead to the next clustering of folks that might attempt to conduct an archaeological excavation to recover remains or material evidence. And these recovery teams will bring home this evidence and turn that over to our peers, our teammates in the laboratory environment that will either attempt to conduct an identification of individual remains, or will attempt to discern further evidence from what was recovered, further clues to try to lead us to different avenues, as I said, to resolve these cases of the missing personnel. In that idealized flow, I glossed over what is perhaps an interesting parallel process that we use. As I was just mentioning, we follow this process of research, investigation, excavation, and then scientific testing and analysis. But there's another subset of cases that we're focused on, dealing with these unknowns, as we've been talking about. These are remains recovered from conflicts that, due to the limits of the reporting, the records kept at the time, the scientific testing possibilities, were deemed unidentifiable, as my colleagues have discussed to some degree here. And so for us, we follow a similar yet admittedly different process of conducting research and analysis to try to construct the most compelling case possible that we think a given set of remains could be associated with a small number of individuals. And the reason for the high standard that is imposed upon us to garner approval to exhume remains and bring them back for attempted identification is, quite frankly, we're disturbing these cemeteries, these memorial places, and we don't want to do that frivolously. So between those two efforts, either culminating in some sort of archaeological excavation in remote locations spread across the world, or through articulating an argument that leads us to exhume a set of remains from a cemetery, we will attempt our identification efforts. And I really want to link the two of these together. They are not completely separated or distinctive activities, in that an excavation in a remote country might enhance our understanding of the flow of battle or the loss circumstances involved in that incident. And that might sharpen up our understanding to the point that we can create a more effective argument that leads us to exhumation of unknown or unidentified remains tied to that battle site. So it is very much a mutually imbricated process that I'm talking about here. We do this with, of course, researchers, historians, anthropologists, archaeologists. We have uniformed service personnel, active duty soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, civilians, government civilians, and contractors that all attempt to resolve these cases each and every day. And we do this in facilities that we have spread across the United States, not quite so many as the NCA, but at a few major locations nonetheless. And then, of course, there's quite an intensive amount of field work required, be that field work in a cemetery, or fields of France that saw combat during the Second World War, the shores of Saipan, or as I said, the cemeteries here in Hawaii, or in the Philippines, or spread across Europe. And what we're playing with, to borrow phrasing from someone else, is the triplicate of the known knowns. We know generally where people were when they were lost, generally, sometimes specifically. But there are known unknowns, as I had just mentioned here. I mean, on occasion, there are remains recovered that we could not identify, but also there are just the simple fact that sometimes people just vanished from muster rolls, from eyesight, from their fellows, from their teammates. People just don't know what happened to them, but know that they definitely are missing. And there are, of course, the unknown unknowns out there, just aspects of the story that we are simply not missing, or not tracking right now. What happened after the war was over? Did somebody disturb the site? Is that going to influence how we attempt to resolve these cases? Well, one way that we deal with the tyranny of time and the crush of numbers is to work with external organizations that want to help with our mission. And by crush of numbers, I don't want to lose sight the focus of each and every individual, each and every family that is impacted by the loss of a loved one. But in the aggregate of the more than 81,000 cases, more than 81,000 individuals, families that are impacted by these losses going back to the Second World War. Just the sheer weight of this moral obligation that the United States government has to help bring home or tell what happened compels us to try to find every possible way to bring home the missing. And to do that, as I said, we work in part with partner organizations to really help expand our ability to hopefully lead to one of those rosettes at one of the cemeteries, indicating that we've successfully identified and sent home one of our fallen. We have more than 60 partner organizations that we work with now in our robust program that we have. And it's only a few years old, but is still growing by leaps and bounds. And this leads us to many different approaches, many different organizations that we seek to work with to orient to our requirements, our approaches, our techniques, and then help them in turn help us go after this tremendous and tremendously challenging mission. But out of that larger framework of partnering with external organizations, we have one specific program established just a few years ago that we've called the Hub and Spoke Network. And through that, we have created postdoctoral or postgraduate positions in research institutions such as the National WWII Museum that allow us to draw in top tier scholars such as Dr. Givens. And these scholars, they assist us with our many complex research assignments and projects that form the mainstay for all of our activities and our work. Adam will talk here in a minute about the specific activities of this program, but suffice it to say for me that we are very proud of this collaborative, large-scale community of researchers that is helping us keep the nation's promise. So with that, I'll end and hand it over to my esteemed colleague, Adam. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Michael. Your ending leads very nicely into my own remarks, which take a little different tack from the others. I'd like to talk about the partnership that exists between the museum and DPA in the form of this Hub and Spoke program that Michael just mentioned, of which I'm a part. And I'd like to discuss this program as well as not only how it functions, but also how it memorializes those missing from World War II in a different way from the other organizations we've heard from today. The museum's a nonprofit, it's not a government entity. Congress did designate it America's National World War II Museum, which presents some weighty responsibilities. It also adopted some pretty lofty goals as a result from the very beginning, and among them is a goal to educate, to urge people to embrace the lessons of the war, to understand the responsibilities that came with victory. But another very large aspect of its mission is to honor the memory of those Americans who were lost in the war, and does this in different ways. I joined the museum here in New Orleans to take up a unique position as the National World War II Museum DPA Research Partner Fellow, and that's a long title, and it reflects sort of the multiple hats that I wear. I'm not a government employee, but my activities at the museum are in direct support of DPAA, and this is because my position is the result of this partnership between the museum and the agency. DPA's Hub and Spoke program is a part of its Partnership and Innovations Directorate. It consists of a network of academic and other educational institutions all across the country that house fellows from a variety of different academic backgrounds and training. Our expertise actually augments the DPA's own researchers, and the Hub and Spoke fellows assist the agency's research and operational needs. We complete assignments that are given to us by DPAA, and Hub and Spoke institutions and fellows, we work on particular problem sets for DPAA, a country, a conflict, or region. My work here at the museum is obviously confined to World War II, but others in the program assist with accounting mission related to other wars. Why do I mention all this? Well, it's to give some context for how the museum undertakes different initiatives to honor those who served during the war, work that goes beyond the exhibits inside the buildings here on campus. The museum's committed to assisting the agency in its mission, which is the fullest possible accounting for missing personnel to their families and the nation. Many people who visit the museum are shocked to learn that more than 70,000 American military personnel are still unaccounted for from World War II. The sole purpose of the research assistance that I provide as the research partner fellow is to try to reduce that number as much as possible to assist the agency's teams in locating, identifying, and if possible, repatriating the remains of fallen service members. And the hope is that my contributions fulfill the missions of both DPA and the National World War II Museum, and that it does that in a few different ways. First, this partnership and my work as part of it can potentially provide information about those lost in the war that might not be found elsewhere. One of the great assets for DPA of having a research partner fellow in New Orleans is the fact the museum has such an impressive archive. It has unique holdings that cover almost every facet of the war. There are nearly 10,000 oral histories available to researchers. The photograph collection alone numbers around 100,000 right now. There's unique, rare, one-off, hand-drawn maps that you won't be able to find elsewhere. Personal paper collections contain personal letters, memoirs, wartime notes, souvenirs, diaries, and journals. And most of these items are donations from private citizens, so not everything available here can be found in government repositories. I'm currently working to share many of these with DPA researchers because there's always a potential that items that come from the museum's archive will provide information or maybe details that hopefully will assist the agency in its accounting efforts. And while my research here at the museum is confined to historical and archival work, other partner fellows throughout the country are supporting DPA in different ways with database creation and management, geospatial analysis, and other technical projects. And this work either fulfills immediate needs or it serves as the foundation for longer-term projects for DPA. A second outcome of this partnership is that my work can help keep some families updated about those missing in action from World War II. For Americans who lost loved ones during the war, they had no remains to bury. Their families were burdened with a sort of enduring grief. And the World War II generation's number is quickly diminishing, but families are still emotionally connected to their loved ones who never returned home. Even some family who never met the missing feel a very deep connection with them and they hope for answers. My work as the research partner fellow includes writing individual case summaries that detail what we know about specific missing. And these can be used at DPA family member updates, which occur up to 8 times a year when government officials meet with family and those missing in action. These events are designed to keep family informed of the government's worldwide mission to account for those still missing and to discuss in detail the latest information available about their specific cases. Government officials meet one-on-one with family to discuss the details of each of their cases. About 150 to 200 family members and 30 government officials attend each meeting. And during these meetings, there are formal presentations, question and answer sessions, one-on-one discussions between the government officials and family. This was all pre-COVID, of course, in person. Since COVID, these have been moved into the virtual realm, but they're still well attended. And this is where my work comes in. Using historical research and writing, I produce these case summaries that provide a narrative as much as the historical record can illuminate at least of a particular missing in action case. And these summaries also include whatever information is available about accounting efforts through the years. So not only do they offer families details of when and where the service member went missing, but also they provide important context about the larger campaign in which they were involved. And since 1995, more than 17,000 family members have been reached in face-to-face meetings such as these. The third and final result of this partnership is that it helps stress significance of the American experience during World War II. One of the essential aspects of the museum's mission is to make certain that those individuals who served their nation are not forgotten, that they continue to be honored for their service. DPAA states that every unaccounted for U.S. service member is entitled to one certainty that he or she will not be forgotten. The museum has an array of partnerships, in fact, with more than one organization represented here today. And along with and alongside the museum, they continue to act as standard bearers that keep alive the memory of those who gave their lives to preserve freedom in World War II. This DPA National World War II Museum partnership is a special one in various ways. I think it fulfills the goals of both organizations. And so long as it continues, it helps recognize the service and the achievements and the sacrifice of those lost in World War II. Thanks everyone for your presentations. They were varied. They gave us all a good idea of the different ways that unknowns from World War II have continue to be commemorated. It's also certainly given us a lot to discuss. So let's get into the roundtable discussion. We have about 20 minutes to talk through some themes that have sort of risen to the surface in your talks. And I think we've heard your organizations, or how your organizations and offices commemorate World War II unknowns. Each does so differently from what we've heard. For some, maybe this webinar is where they've learned that there are actually multiple government entities that have unique roles in this mission. So my question to the panelists is, in what ways would you say the goals of your organizations are unique? How would you differentiate for our audience the specific responsibilities that sort of make up a total government effort to commemorate World War II losses? Please chime in, Allison.
Thanks. Well, I will start. So for Arlington National Cemetery, we have a couple different ways that we commemorate World War II losses. Of course, one of those most obvious ways is by caring for the graves of service members who died during World War II and are buried at the cemetery. But we also have a lot of veterans of World War II who are buried at the cemetery and continue to be buried at Arlington. So we care for those graves and we tell their stories. We have some group burials from World War II. So I think Richard mentioned this. These are graves of multiple intermingled remains. We know who is in that group of remains, but the specific remains cannot actually be differentiated. So they're buried under a group burial marker. And then of course we have the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, which we already discussed. But I want to mention one more thing. Education and interpretation are other missions of the cemetery, and we use those to tell the story of World War II. So we actually have a World War II education module that we're working on, programs like the one tonight, so that while we tend to the headstones and we tend to the grass, we're also really telling these people's stories.
Thanks, Allison. Ben, please.
Yeah, so I think we're a little bit unique, and especially if you look at World War II specifically and not the kind of overall memorialization of American War Dead. But for World War II, we're kind of unique from the other organizations who've talked tonight in that we have sites that are solely World War II focused, which I think is a little bit different. There is no cemetery in the NCAA that is only World War II, and Arlington obviously carries war dead from all of our wars. And so that's a little bit unique for us, and it gives us some opportunities. Like I said, for World War II, we did not do a separate monuments program. So in addition to the actual grave plots, each of our World War II cemeteries includes a chapel, the walls of the missing for those who were missing from that area, as well as a bunch of artwork and architecture to commemorate. And so really there's this kind of unique combination of the graves that kind of, at least in my opinion, really convey in an emotional way when you're standing there how powerful and how huge the sacrifice was for America to win this war. And then kind of the artwork, which allows us to kind of interpret that a little bit and beyond just the sacrifice, convey the meaning of this war and what it meant to both America and the people who liberated. And so I think that's something that, I mean, all of us do very similar missions and all of us have a shared mission. But I do think that's something unique that in many ways can only be found in our cemeteries.
Thanks. Richard, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah,
Michael does. Go ahead, Richard.
So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to touch on three things. So I think we're also somewhat unique just in the geographic scope of our agency. I mean, we are, burying World War II. I mean, we're actively burying World War II veterans, on a daily basis, or the dependents. So I mean, that's very much present in the NCA mission. And also, throughout our cemetery system, we have different World War I monuments. We have thousands of monuments in our system to commemorate the war. And I would say the third tier is, working with DPAA, like in the Punch Bowl. I mean, I know there's a very active program to identify Pearl Harbor remains, and working with DPAA to disinter those remains and then rebury them. Many of them that are identified go in the National Cemetery system. So they go from an unknown to having a marked grave and an NCA site. So that's how I would respond to that.
Thanks very much, Richard. Michael, do you have a comment?
Yeah, I'll provide one other twist. I think that our work here collectively shows the living nature of this history and how it continues to morph and change over time. One specific way that DPA does that, I think in a distinctive manner, is through its interactions with all these local communities across the world. And some of our sites where we conduct field work actually become memorial sites in their own regard. They become, part of some other country's cultural heritage. So we're helping, I guess, further transnationalize the history of the war and continue to show its individual, but also its broader impacts.
Super. I think moving on to sort of the significance of the tomb and cemeteries and monuments, memorials. For most families, memorializing and burying their dead is a very private act. The tomb, though, is a perpetual memorial. It's meant for an entire nation, as we learned from Allison's presentation. So rather than returning home with artifacts of a vanquished enemy to display on the public square, the United States actually returned home with remains of fallen citizens and enshrined them then in a national cemetery. So, you've all sort of, well, Allison specifically touched on this in her presentation, but what do you all think the tomb says about how, on a national level, the United States processed overseas wars in the 20th century after they had already ended? Allison, please.
Thanks. So I'll start us off. I think to me, the key thing that we need to remind ourselves when thinking about the meaning of the tomb and why for these 20th century wars, the United States felt compelled. The government felt like they had to commemorate service members who died and lost their lives, even if they didn't have a grave, was because of the nature of the American military during those wars. These were militaries that were relying on the draft. This was not an all-volunteer military like we have today. So the military and the war and its fatalities touched Americans, a cross-section of the country. No matter who you were, you would probably know somebody who was serving, and maybe you would know somebody who died. So it created an obligation. And especially we see it starting with the Civil War. We could go all the way back, but during World War I and World War II, the American people are saying, we sent our sons and our daughters at some points to go serve. What are you going to do for us when they die? So that's why these memorials like the tomb were needed.
Yeah, thank you very much. Ben?
Yeah, I think that's a great point that Alison makes, that a large part of it is this kind of changing way Americans view the government's responsibility for the dead. And so I think that the tomb is one result of that, because the repatriation program that both Richard and I talked about for World War I and World War II, that is not only is for World War I specifically, not only is that unique among the combatants, it's unique in American history too. In previous wars, the government doesn't take responsibility for bringing home the dead. It's not viewed as a responsibility of the government. So when Richard shared that map of the kind of Civil War era cemeteries, they're all across the South. The only people who are brought home are really when the family pays for it, if the family has the means, or if it's a famous officer. And so the kind of government taking the responsibility for that in World War I, all these next of kin get the chance to have their loved ones brought home. But what do you do for those whose loved ones aren't identified, aren't found? And so symbolically, the tomb kind of answers that government's debt to its people. And I think I want to leave some time for other people to talk, but I think there's also the tomb has changed over time as well. And kind of we see that changing over time. And I think I mentioned this at one point, but I think most visitors don't realize there's 3 bodies there. But we saw this that after World War II, there's such this move that we have to have an unknown from this war put there. And there was so much pressure for Vietnam to do that. And then we kind of see that changing going forward because of a lot of cultural and technological changes. So I'll leave it at that. I could talk all night on this, but.
Great points. Richard, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I would just add that I think the World War I and World War II unknowns, I think they also represent a shift in kind of emphasizing the individual. While they symbolize the nation, they symbolize the collective, they're very much individual. This is an individual set of remains that anyone can relate to on that individual level. And while we have unknowns in the cemetery system from other wars, and we made great efforts as a nation to provide an individual identity, I think when you go into a Civil War cemetery and you see the little 6x6 blocks, or you see the countless unknowns, it still doesn't have that individual weight that the tomb brings to our national commemoration. So I really see it as the shift, the emphasizing the personal identity that anyone can relate to.
Yeah, right. Michael.
Thanks. Yeah, but we're a nation of individuals, right? And so that's sort of the tension and the duality there. Is we're going to focus on the individual, but things like the tomb are very instructive in how we are to remember or commemorate. Granted, it changes over time. It is still a plastic site in that regard, but I think it can at the same time signify pain and loss, but it can also blur the sharp edges over time by kind of, as I said, fuzzying it up, so to speak, by making it a national and individual thing at the same time.
Right. Ben, did you have something else to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Richard brought up about it kind of being this increased focus on the individual. And I had that it'd be more specific than that. It's not just the increased focus on the individual, it's the kind of changing the symbol of those wars and the heroes of those wars. For as much kind of adulation as Persian gets, it's the common soldier that the unknown represents. It's the average American soldier that is lionized. Whereas if you look just the other side of the tomb at the Memorial Amphitheater, what's engraved on there are the names of America's great generals and admirals. And so that change is really, I think, very instructive of World War I's role in American history, especially because the gap between the dedication of the amphitheater and the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown is only about a year.
Right. Okay. I think maybe we can give some context to this, an international context. Eugene Sledge, a Marine veteran of the Pacific Theater, wrote that we come from a nation and a culture that values life and the individual. To find oneself in a situation where your life seems of little value is the ultimate in loneliness. And we hear from veterans of World War II that that fear of dying anonymously was a motivating factor to ensure the remains of their fallen comrades weren't abandoned just as they would want done for them. So my question is there maybe a uniquely American, is this maybe a uniquely American desire on a personal level to commemorate losses, or either recognize them individually by name or maybe anonymously represent them as a much larger group as the tomb does? Is there something that's just so inherently American about how this has happened, or is it something we share with other nations? And Michael.
I'll bite first. Yes, I think we are unique in this regard. It's not just a matter of degree, but also an approach. But I'll just highlight Kurt Peeler's excellent book, Remembering War: The American Way. And I won't just say that because he was on my dissertation committee, but also partly because of that. But I think he did an excellent job some time ago now, emphasizing the unique kind of intermixture of both the federal role, which we're here talking about today, but as it intersects with families or memory activists or non-governmental organizations. So it's very much an American marketplace of ideas and structuring how we think about individuals and the loss and the significance of their loss, and then how that ties to the meaning that we ascribe to the wars that they fought within. So I'm going back to that tension between the individual and the nation that I just mentioned there, but I definitely see through our own agency's efforts, which dramatically, radically dwarf that of any other country in this world, to focus on recovering the remains of these missing service personnel. There is just something hyper specific about how and why America chooses to focus on these individuals, to ascribe meaning to its war. So I say yes. Long way to get back to that.
Well, thank you, and always good to tip of the cap to a former committee member. Ben and then Allison.
So I'm gonna offer a nuanced disagreement here with Michael, but I don't think the tomb itself is not, I think, unique. We saw that almost every other combatant in World War I has a similar tomb, and I don't think honoring the dead and memorializing the dead is unique. My own agency has counterparts in most of the other countries. The Commonwealth Graves Commission for Great Britain tends all the graves. What I do think Mike is right about is that there is a uniqueness in America's kind of dedication to identifying and bringing these home. We're the only country that offers repatriation of known dead in World War I or World War II on a massive scale at government expense. And then we're the only country that has anything equivalent to the EPA working today. So I think that is unique, but I think a lot of the surrounding stuff, they're a very kind of common impulse for all cultures. But it's very interesting if you go to ABMC cemeteries and then go down the road to one of the German war cemeteries or one of the Commonwealth Grave Commission cemeteries, which all tend to cluster in similar areas, obviously. They do have very different kind of aesthetic approaches and different appeals that way. And so I think there is kind of a national uniqueness to how we do it specifically, but it is a universal drive, I think.
Allison?
Thanks. So I'm going to build on what Ben said and take it a little bit more specific to the tomb itself. Of course, the Americans, we got the idea from the British and French who did this the year before. And we emulated a lot of aspects of those burials with our 1921 unknown, but we made it uniquely American. And this was done throughout the types of ceremonies that were created, and it was specifically done by choosing the location of Arlington National Cemetery for the tomb. There was a lot of debate about this. Many people in the public did not agree at first that Arlington was the right site, and one of the reasons they said that was because this is so very much a Civil War cemetery. It is so connected to that conflict. How can we memorialize the World War I dead at Arlington on the former Custis plantation? But when Congress debated it, there was a shift in thinking, and you could see them evolve, and General Pershing was very much a supporter of Arlington because it placed World War I in the center of America's memory of the Civil War and started linking those conflicts as well as the Spanish-American War together. So it created one long trajectory of American memory. And then we get to World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and so forth. It creates a timeline of unified American commemoration. And that is something that's very unique.
Great, thank you. Richard?
You know, mute myself. Just circling back to what Ben had said, something that stands out to me with the repatriation program that kind of speaks to how unique it was bringing the lengths that the United States went to bring its soldiers and its servicemen home. We had to really make a lot of effort to explain to foreign countries what we were doing. I mean, they adopted these graves and took pride in them as their own, and they'd had them for years and were taking care of these temporary cemeteries. And then when the army starts coming in and exhuming them and loading them up to bring them home, particularly in Belgium, they're like, they're kind of crushed that they're losing these service members that they've been caring for. And there a lot of effort has to go into explaining what the United States is doing here and why we're doing that. So, I mean, I think that speaks to the uniqueness of kind of, in contrast to our allies, what we were doing. It's kind of impossible for them to wrap their minds around.
Great. I think maybe we can move on to questions of symbolism. In 1964, Dwight Eisenhower was former Supreme Allied Commander during the war and former President of the United States. He visited the U.S. Cemetery at Normandy with Walter Cronkite for a special broadcast for the 20th anniversary of D-Day. And he was sitting in the cemetery, and Eisenhower said that these young boys whose graves we've been looking at, wondering and contemplating their sacrifices, they were cut off in their prime. I think, hope, and prayed that humanity has learned more than we had learned up to that time. Every time I come back to these beaches, I say once more, we must find some way to work toward peace and to gain an eternal peace for this world. Maybe this question is for Ben, but perhaps Michael can also contribute with his expertise on D-Day and collective memory. There seems to be a visual language at play at the Normandy Cemetery. To what extent was there a conscious effort for American cemeteries to act as something of a multifaceted symbol, beyond the solemn, respectful resting place of the fallen? Were they supposed to communicate something more to the world, to draw out some of the same themes Eisenhower saw, sort of a a warning of the price of war, maybe a call for enduring peace?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think it's true for both World War I and World War II, but it's especially noticeable at the World War II cemeteries because in World War I, the monuments and the cemeteries are separate. World War II, they're combined. And so each cemetery has a memorial, usually a memorial building that includes artwork and architecture. And really, the idea there is that if you look at the grave plots, and really, in my opinion, the grave plots with that kind of iconic view of the white crosses and stars of David row on row, that's the iconic view of our cemetery, and that's the most powerful thing there. None of the artwork can ever compete with that. And it's not intended to, really. Like, those grave plots provide the kind of what Eisenhower is talking about, that feeling of sacrifice. What the artwork does is kind of help the visitor translate that into meaning. And so it kind of translates into why did these people have to die? And so for Normandy example, the major statue work there is called Spirit of American Youth Rising from the Waves. It's very symbolic, very allegorical. And so it helps kind of convey that all these young men died, but there was a reason, and it was to kind of liberate the world, and it did make the world a better place. But at the same time, that kind of triumphant message is translated through the coexistence of the grave plots that show what a cost there was. And I think having those two together is very powerful.
Great points, thanks. Michael?
Yeah, and thanks. Just to build on that, I think site specificity really matters there. There was a process of gradually removing the temporary cemeteries, and it was not foreordained that the current location of the Normandy American Cemetery was going to be right at that spot. It was selected in part because it was overlooking what was the bloodiest part of the battlefield for the American forces, at least, landing there on D-Day. So that symbolism, I think, is exactly on point what Ben was saying, but I think it was driven home by the fact that this was the place where the American liberating forces paid the highest costs, and that is borne out in the manner that the cemetery became a site of commemoration, and the frequent recurrent themes conveyed in the speeches and the political actions conducted there, often linking it to this bloody day, this bloody moment. And I think to Adam, to that video that you were mentioning, it is an interesting contrast as Eisenhower and Cronkite are there staring out over the beach, and they're looking at these French families sunbathing and enjoying the fruits of liberty, bought at such great cost. And there's something about that tandem point with that specific location that matters a great deal.
Yeah, completely agree. Allison?
Thanks. I just want to add one layer of complexity to what Ben and Michael said, and that's as much as I agree with how these cemeteries really get at what Eisenhower was speaking of on Omaha that day, right? That emotion, that personal sacrifice. They also have some other purposes. They project American military and diplomatic power overseas, and they also show that America is not going to forget its military dead, and that's a powerful statement. And just as we see that in the ABMC cemeteries, the same thing is part of how the tomb evolves. The tomb started as that very personal site, but today it's a site of American diplomacy as well. We have heads of state and important leaders, both foreign and domestic, come to the tomb, and that sends a very powerful message about memory and what the nation stands for.
It certainly does. Thank you very much. Ben?
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, I think that's true, very true for our sites and the entire repatriation program, right? Like, not just the American power and diplomacy, but the sheer wealth required for that program and for maintaining permanently, in perpetuity, these sites all across the world with a pristine level of maintenance is a message. I would argue it's not our purpose, but it is certainly a message and a recognizable symbol of America across Europe and the world.
Thanks, everybody. This has been a fantastic discussion. I'm afraid we're out of time for this portion. I want to thank everyone for participating. It was a wonderful time. I enjoyed this immensely. I hope all our viewers have as well. I'm going to hand things back to my museum colleague, Jeremy Collins. He will now run the question and answer portion of the program. I'm sure we have a number of good audience questions. We always do. So back to you, Jeremy.
We do, and thank you, Adam, for running a really interesting roundtable here, and for all of our speakers for your individual presentations. This has been great. We'll start with Allison because it is the first question, but you're also the co-partner in this program. Bevan wants to know about the recent restoration of the tomb. How extensive has the recent restoration of the tomb been? Will the public notice any changes? And are the guards there during the restoration work?
Thank you, Bevan, for that question. There has been a really big conservation program going on at both the tomb and the Memorial Amphitheater in anticipation of the Centennial. I'm not going to describe in detail everything that we've done, but I can give you a few tidbits and also direct you to our YouTube page, where last month in July, our virtual monthly event was actually focused entirely on the historic preservation and conservation of the tomb. So you can hear from our conservator, and in that video, she really describes in detail what they did. But to give you a highlight, one of the issues that the Cultural Resources and Conservation team worked on was the biofilm at the tomb. The biofilm is this complex type of living microorganisms that really likes to live on marble, and it feeds off of the sun, and there's a lot of issues with it throughout Washington, D.C., the Jefferson Memorial. So the conservation team applied some really state-of-the-art treatments to the tomb to try and reduce that biofilm. And one of the biggest differences that you will see is that the tomb and the marble and the plaza itself are much more close to the white that they originally were. So they've taken off some of that biofilm. It's a lot brighter. It looks, the intensity of that black biofilm is much reduced. So that's an exciting thing, and I urge you to look at that video to really hear more from our conservator.
Thank you, Allison. The next question, I think, is mostly directed towards Richard. Comes from Dennis. I noticed a few states had no national cemeteries. Are there plans to have at least one in every state? And I would add to that, Richard, what was the selection process for some of these newer ones?
So what I don't have on that map, we have a lot of state cemeteries. So state cemeteries that would kind of fulfill the need. And the basically what we do is the goal is to basically have a national cemetery available within, I think, don't quote me on this, but I believe like 70 miles from where a veteran might live. So yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of studies ongoing to see where veterans live and where need resides. And if there is a certain need and a certain percentage of veterans that aren't having that burial need fulfilled, then NCA does explore constructing new cemeteries. But also, again, know that there's some cemeteries missing from that map that I just didn't include.
Thank you. The next question I'm going to throw to Ben. It comes from James, and Ben, you had referenced earlier your counterparts across the world, but this one has something to do specifically with one of your own sites. I understand that in Holland, Dutch families will adopt a grave of a fallen Allied soldier and tend to it. Do families in France, Belgium, etc., also adopt a grave of an Allied soldier and take care of it?
Yes. So to start off with, there is a very active grave adopter program at our Netherlands American Cemetery in Marken, Holland. And so there's two parts to this question. The first part is I want to dispel, which is a very common myth, which is that there are locals that tend to the graves at our cemeteries. You'll see this very frequently. Someone will post a video on Memorial Day of someone tending to one of our graves and say that the French are so grateful that America liberated them in World War II that they still, to this day, tend to the graves at Normandy. And so I do want to be clear that our sites are tended to and cared for by the American taxpayers through the American Battle Monuments Commission. It is American employees who tend to the graves. There are, throughout France, Belgium, almost anywhere that our cemeteries are, there are people who adopt a specific grave, and they'll typically research the soldier. In many cases, especially in Holland, and especially in the more kind of recently after the war ended, they'll reach out and try and research the family and contact the family in the States. But they're not tending to the graves. They're putting flowers, they're kind of doing stuff like that. But the responsibility for maintaining the graves on a day-to-day basis is that of American Battle Monuments Commission, and the American taxpayer pays for that. So that's the first part. And then the second part is, yes, this occurs in France, it occurs in Belgium. Holland is the most well organized, it is the most long-standing, and to my knowledge, it's the only cemetery where every single grave is adopted.
Thank you, Ben. This next question might be a joint question for Ben, then Michael. Comes from Tamara. Do we know how many World War II infantry soldiers remain buried in Burma? I'm thinking of those killed in 1944 from the 5307th Composite Unit Group. That's the Merrill's Marauders. I believe we know their names, but they weren't repatriated after the war. So Ben, I don't know if you have anything to say first about burials in Burma, but Michael, you may be able to comment on those of the Merrill's Marauders of the harder to reach areas such as Burma or Myanmar.
Yeah, so after World War II, there was originally a thought of possibly putting a cemetery in Burma, but it was eventually decided to have Manila American Cemetery and then the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific are the only Pacific cemeteries. There are a large number of Merrill Marauders members that are memorialized at Manila on the Wall of Missing. I don't know if we have any burials for there. I'd have to ask kind of Mike to field that question. I do know there are some isolated burials that remain kind of separate from the cemeteries, but that's very rare.
Yeah, I will attest to the limits of my knowledge on the specifics of Merrill's Marauders, but ultimately there are more than 700 missing that we still associate with Burma. That of course includes many of the airmen flying over the hump, but absolutely the Merrill's Marauders is part of the cluster of individuals that we are looking for in that country.
Thank you. We have a question, Allison. I think this would be a good one for you to clarify from Kayleen. I may have missed this, but is the tomb only honoring troops with body parts, not sailors on ships that were exploded and there was no trace?
That's a great question. So again, just to go back, the tomb has 3 sets of remains in it. So it honors those 3 individuals, but it also honors every American service member who has no known grave. So that does actually include sailors, Marines, anybody who was a service member who was lost at sea, aviators who were flying over the oceans and were lost at sea. Anyone who does not have a grave, the tomb is meant to really symbolize them. And that's one of the reasons why during the ceremonies for the burials of the different unknowns, the War Department and then the Department of Defense really made sure to include each of the military service branches so that they were represented and those families knew that their loved ones were being included.
Thank you. This one looks like it's for Arlington and ABMC. So Allison, you're on. Then we'll go to Ben. What commemorative events will Arlington National Cemetery and/or the American Battle Monuments Commission conduct in France in October of 2021? This comes from Gavin, and Gavin may be planning a trip in another couple months.
Thank you for your question, Gavin. So at this moment, Arlington does not have any plans to do anything in France. I wish I would sign up immediately. But I can say that we are working on a program in October with Ben and the American Battle Monuments Commission to commemorate the selection of the World War I unknown that happened in October. So Ben, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so we are hosting a series of events with the Society for the Honor Guard of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. That'll be at the four cemeteries from which the World War I unknown candidates were pulled. So I discussed in detail tonight the World War II selection ceremony. That was all kind of modeled after World War I. And so they pulled a single set of unknown remains from Meuse-Argonne, Saint Mihiel, Somme, and what's the 4th one? Allison, help me out here.
Meuse-Argonne, Somme,
Aisne-Marne, right, Bellawood. And so there was 1 remain pulled from each, and then there's a selection ceremony held. And so we're doing a flag raising and a wreath ceremony in conjunction with the Honor Guard Society. at each of those ceremonies around the same 100th anniversary of that selection, which was on October 22nd.
Thank you. Last question, and it goes to Allison, and then Allison, I know you have some closing remarks before I wrap it all up. Could you please give the release date for the Unknown 100th Anniversary publication? This comes from Hubert.
Hi, Bert. So at this moment, we don't have an exact release date for the publication, but if everybody just stays tuned to the cemetery's website and social media, we will be blasting it everywhere when it comes out. You will be seeing it all over, and we'll make sure that everybody can get a copy since it will be available for free. So thank you, Bert.
And Allison, you had a helpful slide that I'm pulling up right now, if you'd like to speak to the audience as to what this shows.
Sure. So on this slide, we have a lot of information and links about how you can get information and updates about the Tomb Centennial. And I believe these are also going to be placed on the Facebook page and other areas. So these are really the keys for you all to figure out how to participate in the Tomb Centennial, because we really want to make sure that everybody can take part, no matter where you live. So you can do this a couple different ways. You can do it by coming to the cemetery on November 11th, if you're able to. You can do it by taking part in one of the educational modules that we have. Learn about the cemetery, even if you're doing it from home. You can observe a moment of silence on Veterans Day. You can put the flag up at your house on Veterans Day, and you can also participate in our virtual events. So we've highlighted a couple of those on the slide. We have some coming up in September with the National Archives, and then that October event that I mentioned. But I really just want to emphasize that just like the burials of all of the unknowns at the tomb were intended to be for everybody in the country, as well as our allies overseas. That's really the goal here. So we're encouraging you to think creatively, to follow us, see what we're doing, share what you're doing with us, and figure out a way that you can make this centennial your own wherever you live. And that's one of the reasons we were so excited to host this program tonight. All of you who took part were commemorating the Tomb Centennial tonight. And I thank you for that. Thank you for spending your evening with us. Thank you to Jeremy, everybody at the World War II Museum, staff for putting this together with us. And thank you to the excellent panelists. You all have just given us such rich history to really think about tonight.
Thank you, Allison, again, for bringing this to us. Thanks to Dr. Stephen Carney for working with us as well at Arlington. I think, well, I would hope that our audience learned quite a bit about each one of our collective organizations and the important role that we play in not just preserving, but remembering and memorializing and educating. That's what it's about. And as the ages go on and the generations get wider apart, it's important that we have these programs. For anyone who missed part of tonight's program, it will be archived and put on the museum's YouTube page, so you can share that with your friends and family that might not have tuned in. I want to thank not just Allison again, but Ben, who has been helpful on a number of projects. We've got a couple of initiatives with the ABMC, a couple of educational initiatives that are coming up pretty quickly that you can learn more about on our webpage. Richard with the National Cemetery. We have had great hosting there when we've taken our groups out to Pearl Harbor and Punch Bowl. And of course, Michael, who has been a friend of ours for a number of years and been at some of our international conferences and really helpful with this. One of the most important projects we do at the World War II Museum is our partnership with the DPAA. Nothing against anyone else in this room right now, but the idea of helping to put a name and maybe even bring home a body is, there's probably nothing more important that we do. So thank you, Michael. If you enjoyed tonight's program, please keep track of our calendar of events for upcoming programs. Specifically, I'd like to point out our September 9th, 10th, and 11th Memory Wars World War II at 75 and Beyond Conference, where we will actually have a session on commemorating the dead and honoring the dead through burials with one of Ben's colleagues, General John Brown, He'll be joined by a representative from the Commonwealth Graves Commission, as well as the German Volksbund. So tune in for that. And one last time, Allison, thank you so much for presenting this opportunity to the museum, to our followers, and I wish everybody a great evening. Michael, I think being in Hawaii, I hope you have a great afternoon. So thank you, and we'll sign off now. Bye-bye.